Okay,
Good.
you're on air.
This session is being recorded. I see this. All right. So wish I could, I'm going to hide this piece. All right. So very good. So I'm pleased to bring you a class that's one of my favorite studies. I'll just kind of give you a little history. The approach to the class is going to be more or less the same as the last two approaches. So you'll see the wheel and you'll see the spokes and the hub, and we'll talk about that. But I want to share with you, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, still good. Okay, just raise your hands if there's any audio visual issues. Um, but I was doing a study at one time where I was looking through the Gospels and I was looking at the names. And it's an interesting study and it's fun to do, especially if you're kind of at that place and time when you're trying to figure things out in the Gospels. And what you find is there are a lot of connections between the names of the apostles and people that show up. Now, James might be a popular name, so you might find that James shows up a lot, or Simon might be a popular name. But I suspect that the reason people are named, when they say, and James talked to Simon, it wasn't just a Simon, it was somebody they knew, and it seems to be language that's very familiar. And the reason I introduced that is because one of the things I did is I would count the number of times a person was mentioned. And with the apostles, I was kind of surprised. How many apostles are there around Jesus?
Well,
12, right? We all know that. So there were 12 apostles, and when I looked at the distribution of how many each one's named, I was surprised to find that the most named apostle, right, was Peter, and almost twice of any other apostle. And when I looked at the second named apostle, it was John, and then close behind that was Andrew. Um, sorry, I got a little cough. And then almost from that point down, most of the apostles had no more than 5 references in the entire Scripture, not just the Gospels, but in the entire Scripture. And that really shocked me because what it says is while there's 12 apostles, there's about 3 of them that get an inordinate amount of airtime, and the rest are they're almost, we're told that they are there, but they don't play an active role that's represented in the Scriptures. So they're probably doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, but we don't see it. But the other thing that happened is as I was looking through, and I didn't just have something that said there, his name is 243 times, which was about the number of times Peter's name comes up. It actually brought up all the verses, and so I went through and read all the verses. And I can get emotional with Scripture, but I'm generally I'm pretty analytical, so when I'm in my analytical mind, I don't normally get emotional. But by the time I finished the verses, I was dumbstruck. Everything I read about Peter when I read one verse after the other was just super impressive. And I must tell you that before I started that particular study, I had always operated under the impression of Peter that he was a little maybe pretentious. He didn't think a lot about how he acted. He would just go one way and then go the other. But then when I read through that, I realized that I had been getting a snapshot of Peter at different times, and probably had some highlights that were really skewing the way I looked at Peter overall. And then when I went back and then I started doing a healthier study on Peter, I actually found he isn't at all the person I thought he was. And that was the beginning of this conversation, because I will share with you, when you get to the point where Peter is betraying Jesus, and the common premise is that Peter is betraying Jesus because he's afraid to die. And after everything else I see about Peter, that started to not ring true. And so I took a second look at it. I put some text together, and I discovered something in the text that's been there that was laying out the story and the groundwork, but because it's split up in 4 Gospels, we have a tendency to miss it because we'll read one Gospel at a time. And none of the 4 Gospels has the whole story. All 4 of the Gospels have the whole story. And when you do that, you get a different picture. And I want to present that picture to you at this time, and I want to share with you what the whole story is so that you can see what's going on with Peter. Because when I saw that, it really kind of knocked my socks off. When I actually saw what was happening, it was a complete shock. I was completely surprised by it. And hopefully this will be something that you'll find valuable, because then I learned that there are other lessons attached to that news story that I had never had the benefit of prior to that. And it's very specific to our relationship with Jesus. So let's begin. In theory, that was going to do something. Okay. Now we've seen this before, right? Okay, did y'all hear me? Have you seen this before?
Yes.
All right. So what is the outside? What does the tire represent? What does the wheel represent?
God's plan.
What is the master plan? It's like, ding, 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 ding. That's it. Now, who can tell me what the master plan is?
That the earth be filled with the glory of the Lord.
Close. That's Isaiah 11:9.
To say
That the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Right? Little bit different. What it's saying is everybody on the earth, a day is coming when everybody on the earth will know and see and feel and understand God's glory. Hadn't happened yet, but the day is coming. And that's the master plan of God. The spokes are the evidences, the different lines of thought that all connect to the story of Peter and the betrayal. And actually in this one is the sequence of information that's all connected. We have to have the full context of the broader story. And we're going to touch on a couple of things that are to me very interesting. So we're going to touch about the conversation on what Jesus is saying when he tells Peter to get behind him. And we all know about the get thee behind me, Satan. We are going to look at the two oaths that Peter, it's kind of a combined oath, but Peter makes to Jesus. We're going to look at the conversation on Peter and the sword in the garden when the guards come to get Jesus and the evidence there. And we're going to talk about the courtyard and the significance of that. Because those are all elements that they can be different, especially the courtyard can be different than what we're used to. So culturally, their reality is a little different than ours, and we want to get a picture of that. And then in the end, we're going to talk about, okay, so what's the real story with Peter? And I've added another one, and if we have the time, because you know I struggle to keep things in time, if we have the time, then we can talk about the last phase, which is the redemption of Peter, because it's not just the betrayal, then there is a betrayal. But then a redemptive act that happens between Jesus and Peter. So hopefully we'll have that time. Oh yeah, good. So I see where we are. All right, so let's begin. Everybody turn to Matthew 16. I'm actually going to grab a Bible real quick. And let's have one person volunteer to read that. Matthew 16, 15 through 21.
15 through 20. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Did you say 18 or 19? 21.
Through 21.
Okay. "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day.
We're going to talk a little more about the verses that are immediately after this, but I kind of wanted you to pay attention to what happens, right? So here's the conversation. Who do the people say that I am? And I kind of get this visual in my mind. Yeah, they say you're John the Baptist. They say you're the prophet. They say you're the Elijah who's to return. Asks them, you've been with me all this time. Who do you say that I am? Now, who answers Jesus? Who's he talking to?
All of them.
He's talking to 12, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's talking to 12. And who answers Jesus?
Peter. Peter.
Yeah. It's like, I always have this visual now of Peter standing up and saying something. Whoops, that was quick, wasn't it? That was Peter saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is an interesting comment. But I hear one person saying, you're the Christ, Son of the living God, and I hear 11 others going, uh-huh, yeah, us too, right? And that seems to be the conversation when you have Peter showing up. And Jesus makes an interesting comment to him. And I think this is important because it's kind of a premise. So what he's saying is that you don't get to the point of understanding who I am unless God has made it known to you, right? You didn't figure this out. It's not how smart you are. The reason you know this is because God has made it known to you, right? And you see how that's stated? Because this is the kind of thing, when you see this, when you see people identify who Jesus is, then you know it must be that God is revealing it to them. And this is the premise that Jesus is asserting. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And that's useful in other parts of the Bible as well. So let's look at that next verse. We're actually going to, you can actually look at it in Matthew, but we're going to turn to Mark 8, 31 through 33. There's one detail in Mark that's not in the Matthew account. It'd be good if you take notes, and you can look at Matthew 16, verse 20. I think it starts at 22 through the rest of Matthew 16. But Mark is a partner verse, and it says something that's a little different. So why don't we have somebody pull that up?
All right, you said 31 to 33?
Yes, sir.
All right. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and he rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeking his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man."
Very good. Now, I think there's one other thing he says there, isn't there? He says, you've become a stumbling block to me, hasn't he? Did I miss that?
Our version doesn't have it. Our version doesn't.
No, it doesn't. I think it's the Matthew verse that says that. So, 16, 15. Yeah. So the Matthew, yeah. So Mark makes the comment. First, he stops and he looks at his disciples. That's not in Matthew. In Matthew, it says, and you can just write this down. Matthew 16:15, or sorry, Matthew 16, verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Now, the timing of this is immediately before the Passover and going up on the mountain, right, on Gethsemane. And when they're up at Gethsemane, what is it that Jesus is praying, very strongly praying for several hours? Say again?
Let the cup pass. Let this pass me if it's possible.
That's right. So Jesus does not want what to happen?
He doesn't want to have to die.
No, you don't want to have to die. Okay, so you keep in mind, this isn't something new. Jesus knew he was going to die. He knew that was part of his mission and ministry, and he knew that was the method through which God was going to work the redemption of mankind. And there's a whole story that's really interesting when you get to, and I think we talked about it last week or the week before, when he's looking at his apostles and they're falling asleep. He asks, is there another way? And they're falling asleep, and that's representative of death as well. But in this conversation, it's clear that Jesus knows he's a day away from dying, a day or two away from dying. And so when Peter says, because Jesus is saying, now we're going to go into the city and I'm going to be taken, right? I'm going to be taken and I'm going to be rejected by the chiefs, the priests, the elders, and the experts in the law, and then they're going to kill me. So this is on his mind. It's real fresh. It's right up at the top of what he's thinking about right now. So when Peter says, you should not die, you aren't going to die, that's not what should happen here, right? There's two things that I find that are interesting. The first is, it's like the Mark account actually lets you see into kind of what's going on with Jesus. He stops and he looks at his disciples. It isn't just an instantaneous rebuff. He's actually listening and hearing what Peter's saying, and he's looking at his disciples, and then he tells Peter that you've got a problem, right? He tells him, get behind me, Satan, and then he says, you are a stumbling block to me. And I want to talk about the get behind me, Satan conversation, and I want to talk about the you are a stumbling block conversation. So first let's talk about the get behind me, Satan. Now the funny thing is, in this particular context, the word Satan is a Hebrew word, which actually means opposer, accuser, an adversary, someone who is not for you, but someone rather who is against you, right? And it can be used for anybody. It's used as an adjective. So there are times when an angel has been a Satan. There are times when God has been a Satan, and you can get that in 1 Chronicles 24, verse 1, I believe. So the word itself is not suggestive of evil, rather suggestive of being an adversary. The other thing that's interesting about this is the suggestion that Jesus is making, because what he's saying is, you're in the way, you're causing me to stumble. It's like I'm walking over you, but not doing it smoothly, right? And if I don't want to stumble, then what I need is for you to get behind me. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Have anybody here ever heard, in basic conversation, that you're in front of me or you're getting in my way? What I really need is for you to get behind me. Has anybody ever heard that kind of conversation before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would propose to you is, by the evidence of what he says here and what he says next, that what Jesus is actually saying is, you're causing me to stumble, you're one of my apostles, your role is not to get in my way, but rather to support me. What I really need is for you to get behind me. And we're going to look at the verses that follow, and you're going to find that as Jesus continues with the conversation, there's actually one reference where Peter says, fine, I'm going to follow you even if it means I have to go to my death. Now, in the context that Jesus just says that I have to go in to Jerusalem and I'm going to go to my death, for Peter now to change his tune and say, if that's the way it is, I'm going to follow you and I'm going to go to my death, I would suggest that what's happened is he's got behind Jesus. He's now encouraging and supporting. So in getting in his way and being confrontational, he's saying, well, whatever path you're going to walk, I'm going to go with you. And we're going to look at that. So to me, that's what's really happening here. But it's not made as clear as it should be made by the way it was translated. Let's look at the next thing. So, and that's what we just talked about, what it means. So, Jesus in Matthew actually makes the comment that you have become a stumbling block to me. What does that mean? Why would Jesus be stumbling?
For one thing, maybe it's the temptation
Mm-hmm.
is what it is, and
Yep.
he
Well,
needs to support him and help him.
absolutely, right? I mean, we know that Jesus doesn't want to die because we also see what's going to happen in just a little bit, right, when he's praying on the mountain. And we know he didn't suddenly decide he didn't want to die. He knows it's been with him the whole time, but now he's getting close, right? He's really having to face what's just about to happen in a day or so. I mean, 3.5 years, he can kind of put it. I don't know if you're like me, but if I know I've got something really big coming, I can kind of put it in the back of my mind. But when it gets close, when it's getting time, and I know it's about to happen, now suddenly I have to kind of figure out how to deal with it. And now, if I'm committed, I just figure out how to work through it, right? But a lot of times I don't have to emotionally deal with it until I'm right in front of it. And I think that's what Jesus has done. He's committed to it. He's walking the path that he has to walk. But there's nothing like coming face to face with it in the last day to have to really figure out how to emotionally deal with it and struggle with it and master it. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that's exactly how Peter's response is, but Jesus is like, don't give me more reasons not to go forward with this, right? I need you to get behind me. I need you to encourage me. So let's turn to James 1:13, because we're going to talk about what Jesus is saying, because I find this pretty interesting about Jesus. He's telling us something about himself, right? And anybody want to read James 1:13? It's the whole section there about temptation. It starts with, you must not say that God tempts, because he doesn't tempt anybody. It's through the whole temptation discussion.
When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me that what God is telling us in James 1 is that the desire that's in us is evil. Evil does not mean malicious, by the way. Evil has the idea, especially as it comes from the Hebrew, of destroying or undoing that which is good. So malice is malice, and malice can be evil, but evil means to undo that which is intended or undo that which is created. So the desire that is within us can lead us to undo the good behavior God has designed us for. And in that context, what's happening with Jesus is he has a desire to live, which isn't bad in itself, except that Jesus knows it is his objective, his mission, is to be obedient even to death. So what's happening is he's being tempted by the thought of finding a way around death. And Peter is introducing and pressuring that point. And so that's what he's telling Peter. He's like, I've got enough to deal with putting down these desires that are not aligned with God. I really need you to get behind me and encourage me in this conversation. Because that really tells us, Hebrews tells us that he was tempted in all ways just like we are, and that's in Hebrews 2. So what you find is this is a little glimpse of Jesus actually being tempted, and he responds to it beautifully. And I'll call your attention to one more thing. James 1:13 doesn't say that temptation is sin. He says temptation is human, right? And when you listen to your desires, when you entertain them, they will lead you to sin, and sin will lead you to death. What's interesting is the way Jesus responds to his temptation. He has the temptation, right? It's the encouragement that he shouldn't have to die. He doesn't want to die. But his immediate response is, this is not the plan of God. You've got to keep your eye on the plan of God. And I really need you to get behind me and encourage me. Why? Because I'm struggling with it. And I need your help. That's why you're here. And it's an interesting thing because the other thing he shows us is exactly how we're supposed to work together. Right? At any given point in time, each one of us is going to have things that are, desires that are going to draw us away from what God has designed for us. And we shouldn't encourage each other to go towards those desires. We should instead get behind one another and encourage each other to not give in to desires that are unhealthy, spiritually unhealthy for us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go forward from there. But I wanted to bring that up because it shows you where Peter was thinking, and we're going to look at what shifts in Peter's mind, what shifts in his thinking. So let's turn to Matthew 16, and somebody read verse 24 and 25.
When they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him, saying, "First." Oops, sorry.
Yeah, I'm like, where are you?
16.
I was going to say, I've just changed my whole class. We're going to talk about the 2 drachma tax.
If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.
Yep. And I think we're going to go, let's see. Yeah, let me just keep going because I think I've got this. I hope I got the right verse here. Yeah, let's look at John. Yeah, thank you. So that's Jesus. He's talking to his apostles at the exact same time, right? Just after the whole get behind me conversation. And he tells them, I'm going to go and I'm going to be, killed. And then he says, if you want to be in my kingdom, right, you have to follow me. You have to pick up your cross. It's not just me. So you have to deny yourself, your own personal desires, and you have to be willing to pick up your cross and follow my example, to follow me. Let's look at John 13 and 36 and 37, because here's where we see what Peter is going to shift to. So anybody want to read that?
A new covenant I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another.
Okay, we just did it again. Let's look at chapter 13, verse 36 and 37.
Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, Where I am going, you cannot follow me, but you will follow me later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times.
The other verse was really good too, so no harm done. The 36 and 37 are important though because they're in context, and these are after the conversation about taking up your cross and following me, right? When Jesus has said that he's going to go to the city and then he's going to be taken and he's going to be killed. And Peter says, well, I will, why can't I follow you? Because Jesus says, where I'm going, you can't follow. And Peter's thinking very physically, right? He's like, well, you've already told us you're going into the city. Why can't I follow you? And he said, because I would lay down my life for you. Now, you think about this. These are not, this isn't a whimsy. He's not just thinking out loud. Peter's actually telling Jesus, you're saying I can't follow you, but I would not only follow you, I would die for you. Right? So if you're going to go, that's what he's telling him. If you're going, I'm going. Right? I'm not leaving you. And that you have to kind of see this, because this conversation from Peter isn't just speaking lightly off the cuff. He's actually telling Jesus, you said you're going to go, that you're going towards your death. You know, and you said I can't follow you. Why can't I follow you? Because you know I'm prepared to die for you. And Jesus actually says this is where you get the connection, because Jesus says you think you're going to follow me, but you're actually going to deny me. And what do you think Peter thinks when Jesus tells him that?
Untrue.
Anybody? What is the thought? You might guess it. If Jesus told you, you think you're going to follow me, but really you're going to deny me, you're going to reject me, what would your thought be?
Sadness.
Would you actually accept in your mind that that's true?
No.
No.
No. Nope. Right now, I would love to believe, and I wouldn't let myself believe differently, that if Jesus were here and we were going, I would follow, period. Right? Undeniably. I mean, he's talking face to face with Jesus. Jesus has said, you're going to deny me, and Peter's like, I don't see how that's going to happen. I just don't see how that's going to happen. Right? Because I would do anything. And Peter's already given up 3.5 years of his life. It's not like he just met him last weekend. Right? He's lived on the streets. He travels. You never know where you're going to sleep tonight. And you just follow. And that's what he's done for 3.5 years. So he's not just speaking off the cuff. All right? So this is what he's telling us, and this is what we hear, and this is what we really should hear. I'm following you, and I'll go with you to your death. And that's his words. That's what he believes. That's what he knows is true. And it's important we understand it properly, because you have to see what's going on in the rest of this account. So he tells them he'll disown him 3 times now. So let's look at the evidence of the courage, right? So we know that they go on the mount on Gethsemane, and that Jesus prays, and they pray up there for hours. And we know that Peter and John and Andrew fall asleep 2 or 3 times. And we know at the end of that Jesus says, okay, it's time to go, because my persecutors have come for me, and my time has arrived. And so they all go down. Now, I don't know if you recall, we're going to look at John 18, 3 through 11. Before we do that, I want somebody to look up Luke 22, verse 36 through 38.
Luke 32.
22.
Luke 22, verses 36 through 38. 2 verses, 3 verses.
He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in you. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough.
So I love the story of the garden and what happens at Judas's betrayal. Specifically from the conversation of Peter having a sword, because before all this happened, Jesus said, look, tough times are coming. Make sure you have your cloaks. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloaks, right? Because you're going to need it. Now, this is so peculiar for Jesus to have this conversation. And the apostles said, well, look, we've got 2 swords with us. And Jesus said, okay, that's enough. Two's good enough, right? Now, what do you think he's setting up, right? And so now we look to John 18, because that's just the morning of, right? This is early on, in the same day or in the 2-day period before this event happens. So let's look at John 18, 3 through 11.
So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?"
If you're not, if you don't think for a moment that Peter's just a little confused, I mean, it was just a few hours ago that Jesus is saying, "Now make sure you have a sword," right? And like, "Oh yeah, we got a sword. Okay, that's good. Just making sure you have a sword." And then Peter pulls the sword out and cuts off the ear of the, Malchus's priest. And Jesus is like, "What are you doing? Put that sword up." He's like, "Well, what are you supposed to use a sword for, But it's interesting, when you look at Peter and the whole conversation, we see Peter and we see the Malchus, the servant of the high priest. But really, when you look at all four Gospels, one of the Gospels makes the comment that they had a detachment of Roman centurions. Another one said it had officers of the temple guard. Another one said that there was a mob and with various weapons. And another one talks about there being the leaders and servants and some of the priests. So I'm sure that what's going on is there's a broad support group because of the potential for Jesus to have quite a large group of disciples with him. In fact, it shows that we only have the 12 apostles, really. So there's not a large number of people. But if you've got a detachment of Roman soldiers, the way I like to talk about it is a Roman soldier is a trained murderer. They are combatants that are trained to combat and to kill people in hand-to-hand combat. They don't drop bombs from an airplane, 30,000 feet high. They're used to putting knives into people's bodies and killing them, and they're very, very good at it. And you've got a detachment of them. And you've got the temple guard, and these are also trained soldiers, right? So these are like the Israel elite forces. And you've got a detachment of the Romans and a group of the temple guard, and then rabble that have their own various pitchforks or whatever that they could use. And you got 12 men in Jesus. So I got to ask you a question. What was Peter thinking when he drew his sword?
Then he might as well die because there were a bazillion people there and he could very well die for his actions.
Absolutely. And what did he already tell us about his conviction with respect to Jesus?
He said he would die for him.
Absolutely. I'm going to go with you, and if you're going to go to die, I'll die with you. So when he drew his sword, one of two things was going to happen. Either Jesus was going to establish himself, and these men would have no power against Peter. And you could read Zechariah, and it talks about, that the might of Israel would be like the might of the mightiest men, and the might of Judah would be like 10 times the might of Israel, right? So he knew that one of two things could happen. There are all sorts of examples in scriptures when the power of the Spirit comes upon someone like Jonathan, and he goes and kills hundreds of people who are also soldiers. Or he was going to die with Jesus, one of the two. But in either case, what he also knew was he's here with Jesus, right? And he's not afraid. And I think that's important to understand is the evidence. I mean, we can read the text and say, well, the servant's ear, big deal. But yeah, when he pulled that sword out, he was going to war. And he had real soldiers. He's not a real soldier. He had real soldiers a whole detachment of them, and a whole group of the officers of the temple guard that were all there, and they would have immediately responded to his violence. And Jesus stopped it before it got out of hand. Okay? He was not responding to fear. He was responding to his desire to protect Jesus as a servant, a friend, and somebody who loved him. And I think that's interesting. So he's ready for violence. He's not afraid of the outcome. So the question I ask is the evidence so far that he's operating on the basis of fear.
No.
What do you think?
No.
Don't see any fear yet, right?
Uh-uh.
Okay. Well, let's continue. I want to talk about the house. I've seen various. This is for representation purposes only. It isn't precisely what a lot of Mideastern homes have, but all of the Mideastern homes of any size have some form of courtyard or maybe multiple courtyards. Now, the story now progresses to the point where they're going to take Jesus to the home of Annas. And then from Annas' house, he goes to Caiaphas' house, right? But it talks about them being in the courtyard. It talks about one of the apostles knows the priests and is let in. And he's the one that lets Peter in. But we know that Peter ends up in the courtyard. We also know that Jesus is being harassed and asked questions and accused by false accusers in the courtyard. So I'm going to ask you a question because I want you to look at this picture and I want you to see kind of a representation of a courtyard as that middle space out in the open. It's very common for these variety of homes throughout many cultures. So if you're a servant in a house, what's your job?
Probably one of them would be to take care of the courtyard.
Yeah. Not only that, but if you've got a lot of visitors in your home, you have to feed them, you give them drinks. I mean, you have to sustain them. It's the duty of a host, right? And in the Mideastern culture in particular, and Semitic cultures, are very much around the idea of hospitality. It's very important to be a hospitable host. So your servants need to be able to hear the requests, and they need to be able to see. So it's a common practice that if you're drinking and your drink is running low, that you don't have to ask. A good servant comes and fills it and then moves on and does that without intervening in your conversations. So they've got a lot of people. They've got very important priests. Again, they have the guard. They have some soldiers with them, right? They have some of the Sanhedrin and some of the Pharisees. And so these are not rabble now. These are the important people, the upper echelon of the community and the culture of the day, especially the Jewish ones. So what's happening is the servants have to be nearby. They have to be ready to provide food, to provide drink. If they are calling for one of the witnesses, they would go to the door, let the witness in, because all the witnesses aren't going to be standing there at the same time. So this is what the servants are about, and when Peter's let in, he's let into where the servants are, which means that, like the servants, he can not only hear every single thing that's going on, he can see it, right? So he's a direct witness to what's going on with Jesus. Now, what did Peter say he was going to try to do? What did Peter tell Jesus he was going to try to do? Well, more than just die with him, didn't he say, why can't I come with you? Why can't I go where you're going?
Oh, yes.
Right?
Right.
And so the idea is, as much as it's possible for him, he's going to follow Jesus. Right? And he has. He's followed him right into the courtyard, and he now can be a witness to what's going on with Jesus. The interesting thing is, what is their primary objective with Jesus? Now, they've got him, right, and they want to kill him, but what do they have to do if they're going to kill him?
Convict him.
Yeah, and how precisely are you going to convict somebody?
I mean, you have to go through a trial.
Absolutely. And what do you want to bring into a trial if you want to convict somebody of doing something wrong?
Witnesses?
Witnesses. You got to have witnesses. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at what the Scripture says about witnesses. So we talked about where is Jesus? He's in the courtyard, right? The servants are in the courtyard, and we know where Peter is. He's also in the courtyard. So we covered that. Now, let's look at the betrayal. The actual betrayal that happened. So let's look at Luke 22. This is a lot of verses. How about I read? So, and 54 through 70. Then seizing Jesus, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. We talked about that. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted. So this is over some time. This isn't just 15 or 20 minutes, right? This is a couple hours. Another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Now I'm going to stop there. The rest of the verse talks about the actual conviction of Jesus because they couldn't find enough witnesses to convict him. Because the law requires a couple witnesses, and we're going to see that in Deuteronomy. But here's the points that are brought out here. The priests and the leaders are seeking and willing to entertain, by the way, false witnesses. Now, who do you think prepared the false witnesses before they went in to witness?
The priests.
Yeah, because you know at 2 in the morning, there aren't people just walking around waiting to witness against Jesus, right? These people were prepared in advance. So the priests and the leaders were seeking witnesses to convict Jesus, and they needed 2, and we're going to see that in Deuteronomy. We see that Peter denies 3 times knowing who Jesus is. I'm about to address what the real denial is here. We see that Jesus makes eye contact because they're within eye contact of each other. So that just affirms what we already knew. Jesus is in the courtyard. Peter's in the courtyard. Peter's a witness to every step of this. But when Peter finishes, guess what? If Peter can hear what's going on, who else can hear what's going on? Jesus. I'm gonna share with you an interesting little tidbit at the end here. But Jesus was waiting for Peter to deny him the 3rd time. And when he did, Jesus turned around, and Peter knew. Peter didn't realize that he was denying Jesus, at least not the way he thought it was going to happen. So when you get to verse 70, what you find is that ultimately, false witnesses don't end up convicting Jesus. Jesus gives his own testimony. And I would tell you, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because Jesus didn't go to the cross on the basis of someone else lying. Jesus went to the cross as an act of obedience, which means it had to be of his own free will. So it couldn't be that someone tricked him into getting killed, right? So it really makes sense. God is in the works of this whole sequence of events. And so then you got to ask the question, well, then why did Jesus let it go on so long? Because ultimately, he gave his own testimony. Now, that's just a question for contemplation. But let's look at Deuteronomy 17:16. Somebody please read that one for me. Cool.
Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again.
Is that Deuteronomy 17?
Yeah.
Yep,
Is it?
it's probably in the mouth of two or three witnesses that may be established.
I may have written it down wrong if that's the case.
It's 16.
That's the wrong one. When we finish, I'll look it up. There's a Deuteronomy. I wonder if that's Deuteronomy 7. Anyway, I just pulled it up a little while ago, and I just pulled the wrong verse. So there's a Deuteronomy verse, which I'll share with you in a minute, that what it says is that that any man that is convicted of murder, any man that is put to death must be put to death on 2 or more witnesses, that if you do not have at least 2 witnesses, you may not put them to death. And this is interesting, especially when you get into the conversation with the law and with the priests, because they were prepared to lie, to create false witnesses, and to go out of their way to follow the form of the law by requiring 2 witnesses. Even when the false witnesses they prepared couldn't agree, then they couldn't do anything. It's funny, because they were breaking every aspect of the law, but because they couldn't make the law match up, well, they couldn't put them to death. And you can see how God's hand is at work here. There is, however, another Levitical law that says if the high priest adjures you, that you must give witness. So it's not like in the U.S. you can say, well, I'm going to plead the fifth. There is no fifth. If the high priest adjures you, you must give witness in the sight of God. And that's one, and if you read in the King James, I believe it is, the high priest adjures Jesus to give witness whether or not he is the Son of God. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Yes?
It was 17:6.
Oh, that's what I did. Cool. So read it.
On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness.
Very good. So it's easy to get 1 witness to lie. What's really interesting is after coaching the witnesses to tell stories, they couldn't get 2 of them to tell the same one. Right? But what we know is in one of the Gospels, one of the witnesses acknowledged or proclaimed that Jesus said he was Son of God. Right? So I have 1 witness who has proclaimed that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, all I need to find is another person who could acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. Who in that courtyard would be able to witness that he knows that Jesus is the Son of the living God?
Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Peter.
Yeah. Peter is the second witness, isn't he? So all Peter needs is for one of those people to say, aren't you one of his disciples? Wouldn't you know? All he needs is the high priest, or Annas or Caiaphas in either case, to ask him, tell us who Jesus is. Is he the Son of God? Does he claim to be the Son of God? Because if he did that, what would happen?
He'd be put to death. And
Yeah.
Peter didn't want to say that to get him put to death.
So when you follow what's happening, Peter's sitting in the courtyard, listening to the priest, seeking a witness who's going to proclaim that Jesus is the Son of God so that he can put Jesus to death. They've already had 1 witness that's come across and proclaimed that Jesus is claimed to be Son of God. And Peter knows good and well 2 things. He's promised, more or less asserted, that there's no way he's going to leave Jesus. In fact, he's prepared to die for Jesus. right? But he's sitting here in the courtyard, and if he stays here long enough, it's inevitable. Sooner or later, the priest is going to get around to him. One person saying, "Aren't you one of his followers?" And the priest overhears it. And there's going to be a question directed at him about whether or not Jesus is actually the Son of God. And as soon as this happens, right, the man that Peter said, "I am prepared to die with you," would actually be put to death. You see, the premise I'm operating with is Peter wasn't afraid to die. That's why he wasn't afraid of being in the courtyard. But when he found himself in the courtyard, he got surprised. He discovered that they were running a mock trial, and all they were looking for were two witnesses who would testify to Jesus being the Son of God. And as soon as he discovered that, he now is in a trap, because he's said that he won't leave Jesus' side. In fact, he's prepared to go to his death with him. But by the very fact that he's standing there, he's at risk of putting Jesus to death. And that is not what he was after, right? Was he after seeing Jesus die?
No.
No. He didn't want Jesus to die. He was prepared to die on behalf of Jesus, he thought, but he wasn't prepared for Jesus to die. So there is a betrayal, but the betrayal isn't the one we thought it was. Anybody want to take a stab at what the betrayal is?
He denies knowing him, that he was one of his followers.
Yep. But what's funny is the basis for that denial is protecting Jesus' life, he thinks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Where Peter, I mean, and let's face it, that is a denial, although in that context, you can see how he's rationalizing it.
Becoming a stumbling block by not sort of allowing Christ to do what he needed to do.
I see. Yeah.
Yep.
He's denying the purpose of God in a sense.
Yeah. And he doesn't know what his part in it. He's confused by the circumstance. He's surprised that, his oath to stick with him through thick and thin may be the real reason Jesus has to die. You can see this is a sticky spot. And then ultimately, where he really, what the real denial is that he gave his word that he would stick with Jesus and he left. And I think what you end up getting to is he's battling between these two states. Do I stay and risk being the reason Jesus dies, or do I leave and break the very word? Because what's the thing that happens, right? Remember that Peter tells Jesus, "Why can't I follow you? I'm prepared to go with you to your death." And Jesus says, "You think that's true, right? But you're going to deny me, right? You're going to deny me 3 times." And the real denial at the end is that, it really is that what he said he was prepared to do, he wasn't going to stay because he was afraid of the impact on Jesus. And he actually said, "I'm going to stay with you," but then he didn't, right? And we're not surprised by that either, because Jesus also knows that when the shepherd is struck, what's going to happen?
Sheep will scatter.
There's no way he's staying with him through the whole trial, is it?
No.
Because we already know from prophecy that when he's struck, his sheep would scatter. So anyway, I kind of wanted to present that because I think there's the verbal denial, but the verbal denial isn't because Peter's afraid that he's going to die. There's a verbal denial because Peter realizes that his word, if he ever gets called on as a witness, will lead to Jesus' death. Now, I don't know about you, but if my testimony led to the death of a man that I knew was innocent and righteous, I would find it very difficult to live with that on my conscience. And that's the fight he's in the middle of. And it's not obvious because of the way the scriptures are laid out. But when you look at the evidence, that's where I conclude. He's terrified of the outcome of his witness. So he ultimately runs away. And in the process of running away, discovers that Jesus knew what he was talking about all along. So Now, I try to figure out how in the world to apply that, and we're gonna go look at. So the real betrayal, we just talked about it, is priests were seeking witnesses. Peter had made promises to follow Jesus even into his own death, and the servants expected Peter could be the second witness, and in fact he could have been. So he was terrified that his own word would convict Jesus, but didn't want to break his promise to stay with him. And how do we apply that to ourselves? I mean, there's 2 or 3 ways we can. What do you think? What does that mean to you? Because we're told this story because it's relevant to us, because it has to do with the plan of God. That we as God's children will all be united with Him, with Jesus, in the knowledge of His glory and sharing in His glory on the earth after sin and death have been removed and destroyed. That's the plan. And we're told that. So we're given this account of Peter so that we can learn something from it, so that we can continue to progress towards that kingdom. Any thoughts? It's complicated a bit, but what do you think?
We need to be careful what we say we'll do because we don't know all of God's plan.
Yeah, that's a real clear one, right? You may know how you feel, you may know how you think, but when you say something, when you profess something, when you assert something as a vow, you need to be careful because you don't know what's coming, right? Peter could have told Jesus, I love you, I will always love you, I will do the best I can to always obey you, right? And I will do everything I can to stay with you, or maybe just stop right there and obey you. And then when push comes to shove, he wouldn't have been held by his word to an impossible circumstance, right? What else?
Tell the truth.
Tell the truth. What's the worst that could have happened had Peter been asked?
The same thing that ended up happening anyway.
Yeah. Jesus already said he was going to his death. He had already accepted that. So then if Peter had been a part of that, would that have brought glory to God?
Yeah.
I think so. Would Jesus have been proud of Peter saying, I'm not telling you what he says, I'm telling you who he is. He is the Son of the Most High God. That's my witness. They may not have even been, the funny part is, they may not have been able to do anything about that because what they were looking for was witness to what Jesus proclaimed. So had Peter, instead of being afraid of being the second witness, actually made himself the first witness, I'm not witnessing about what he said. I'm telling you what I know is true. He is the Son of God. Right? That, the only problem with that is Jesus then told them, do not tell anybody. So there is that angle of it. But worst case scenario is then you're witnessing to truth. Right?
But why would Jesus be killed for being the Son of God? Now, I know that one time that they picked up stones to stone him because he said, for what miracle do you want to stone me? And he said, the people respond, not for the miracles, but because you, being a man, make yourself to be God, or are claiming to be God. So the scriptures clearly said a Messiah would come. So if he is the Son of God, i.e. the Messiah, why would they kill him?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I think there's probably a conjunction or a union of 2 things that's happening. First of all, there's already a concept in Greek mythology that's prevalent in the day that has to do with sons of gods. So you get it with Apollos, you get it with Hercules. There's a myriad of sons of gods where this idea of God having children through mortal women has become a quasi-commonplace Greek, Roman mythos. So the Jews would know that that's garbage, right? And really introduces a whole different God problem. And so the second thing is there's kind of a premise, and one of the statements they make is by saying that you're the Son of God, you're making yourself to be equal with God. But the concept of Son of God has to do more with the idea of manifestation and kind of a familial relationship. So you get in, like, if you want to look at Luke 3, and I believe it's verse 32, there's a conversation that Adam is the Son of God. And there's only two men that we have identified as the Son of God, and God created him out of the dirt, breathed into his mouth, but as such, he's the Son of God, right? So there's a creative aspect that makes us his offspring, and that kind of matches what you find in Acts 17. As some of your own poets have said, we are the children of God, right? And then there's the other aspect. Now, when you look in the scriptures about sons of God, we did this 2 classes ago, where God says, if you are living righteously based on God's way, if the Spirit leads you, then God gives you the right to be called a son of God. But Jesus is perfect, right? As a matter of fact, a couple of the scriptures make comment to God proclaiming him to be his son, but he doesn't do that at birth. He does that at the point where Jesus is baptized. So when Jesus proclaims himself to be living a mission in perfect obedience to God, that God proclaims him to be a son. So you have both, that God had his hand directly in his creation and birth, but you also have, one is sonship by proclamation, right, which has to do with obedience, living right, being led by the Spirit. And Jesus knows this, right? This is not alien to Jesus. So Jesus also knows that while he's the Son of God, right, and the Son of Man, which is both by anointing, by creation, and by his mission, his purpose, which is connected to the anointing. I don't want to walk myself in a circle here. I hope this is clear. He also knows that there's also a conversation about children of God that applies generally to all of those who are in the family of God, as men and women. So for him to proclaim sonship with God is to proclaim that he's being led by the Spirit, that he knows who God is by character, and that he's following the very plan and purpose of God in every step. And God himself has proclaimed that that's true. So I think what's happening is they're interpreting what he's saying as identifying that he's lineage from God, which would be apostate, and he's actually telling them something else, and they're not recognizing what he's trying to communicate, or what he's communicating. I should say he's not trying to communicate something. He's communicating something very directly when he finally gets to that point, but they're not equipped to properly understand it. So, and you do have in the Old Testament a little bit of discussion about Israel being his children, and that there are sons and daughters of God. I think Malachi has a reference to it. I think Zechariah has a reference to it. There's not a lot of discussion in the Old Testament about sons of God or children of God. But the few that have it talk about Israel as a nation being his children, right, as well as his bride, which is a different conversation. So yeah, I think it's a combination of things, but I think the first and foremost is the religions of the day that are non-Jewish have that concept in them, and they're wrong, and the Jews know it, and that they think he's talking about direct lineage, which really would be apostate. And he has a lineage from the standpoint that God created him through a woman, but it's not like Zeus came down and had sex with. That's not what's happening when the Spirit creates the seed in Mary. So that's what they're doing. That's my way of understanding what they're doing. I don't know if that's precisely right or not, but. Did I confuse anything worse than it already was?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll move forward. And we're kind of at the end of our time. I have the presentation to you. I want to point out very quickly what it is. I won't go through the whole thing. But in John 21, we have Peter's restoration. And it's very interesting because it actually Jesus starts from the most exalted and works his way down. And he's going to ask Peter first, do you agape me? Do you love me? But agape is the word he uses in the Greek, and it's, do you love me with an absolute love, like a father for a son? Do you love me with that kind of love more than anybody else? Sorry, I'm going to sneeze. I always have two. You can predict. So he starts off, and he starts at the highest level. It's a reverse progression. So the first one is, do you agape me? Do you have a father's love for a child more than anybody else, more than any other apostles? And Peter actually responds. He said, yes, Lord, you know. You know that I love you. But the funny thing is, when Peter responds, he doesn't use the word agape. He uses the word philios. So Jesus says, do you have an all-encompassing love more than any of the others that are around? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I know that I phileo you. And the phileo is a brotherly love. Like, I love you like a friend. So the real conversation is, so you think you love me, you know, you've professed in the past your love for me. So now that we've gone through all this, do you really think you love me with an all-encompassing love more than anybody else? Yeah, Lord, I get it. I have a brotherly love for you. So he's really saying, I recognize that I do not have an agape love for you. That's what the first comment is. The second comment is, so he now doesn't say, do you still believe that you have an all-encompassing love for me more than anybody else? The second statement is, so do you believe that you have an all-encompassing love for me? And his response is, yes, Lord, I understand that I brotherly love you. So he's also again saying, I get it. I don't have an all-encompassing love for you, but I still love you like a brother. Right? But all we hear is, yes, Lord, you know that I love you, because the English doesn't say what the Greek does. And the third time, Jesus says, so do you phileo me? So this love, and I said agape, and I miswrote it, is not agape, it's phileo. So do you phileo me? And it says that on the third time that Peter gets upset at the Lord. And we wonder why he's asked 3 times, why is he getting upset? But the reason he's getting upset is because the first 2 were about an all-encompassing love, and now Jesus is saying, so do you think that you have a brotherly love for me? And he gets upset, and he tells Jesus, yes, Lord, you know, right? And Jesus stops at that point. But I want to back up, and I want to show you the progression that's happened here, right? So the progression that's happened here is in 3 parts. Because you can't love, the demonstration of your love more than anybody else, an all-encompassing love where you're not even worried about how much other people love him anymore, right? It's just you love him so much. And he associates that with the idea of feeding my lambs. And I'm going to back up in just a second. Now, having an agape love, which is an all-encompassing love of Jesus, he associates with taking care of his sheep. But a brotherly love for Jesus, he associates with feeding my sheep. Now, I'm going to run you back through this the opposite way, because what Jesus is actually doing is saying, I'm going to back you down to where you really are, but I'm going to tell you the key to how to get to that place. So if you want to love Jesus like a brother, you develop that love by feeding the sheep. Now, he's saying the feeding the sheep is the easiest of the 3 things, because it's not hard to lead sheep to grass, right? You don't have to pick them up. You don't have to make them chew, right? You don't have to grab their mouth and make it happen. You just got to get them to the grass. And if you can get them to the grass, they'll eat, right? And the sheep will be cared for. And you'll bring them down out of the mountains when the storms come, and you'll take them up into the mountains when it gets too hot. But it's not a hard thing to do. You just have to lead them a little bit and let them go to it, you know. And maybe you have to protect them a little bit. But when the second one, and through that you become brotherly love. You learn to love Jesus as your own brother, which is a good thing, right? We don't argue, we don't debate that. It's a good thing to love Jesus like a brother. But if you want to love Jesus more than a brother, if you want to have an all-encompassing love, if you want your relationship to be mano a mano with Jesus, one-to-one with Jesus, close, inseparable, he says, well, take care of my sheep. And taking care of sheep is a lot different than feeding sheep, right? If they get hurt, right, you've got to bind up their wounds. If a wild animal comes at them, you've got to protect them from the wild animal, right? You don't just make sure they're getting fed. It's the whole package. You make sure they don't get hurt. You make sure they live well. You shear them so they don't have too much wool on them. It becomes a full-time job. But the funny thing he says, and by the way, who are the sheep in the conversation?
The disciples.
Yeah, I would say disciples is fair. Anybody that counts themselves as a follower of Jesus qualifies as a sheep. Because all of us listen to his voice and follow him because we recognize him as our shepherd, right? He's the good shepherd from the scriptures. So the interesting thing Jesus is saying metaphorically is if you help feed, and he's probably not talking about physical food, although physical food's not a bad start, but if you help spiritually feed my sheep, then you'll learn to love me. If you do what needs to be done to take care of their needs and their welfare, you protect them, you help them grow, you help them, if they need to be sheared, you shear them. If they need to be clothed, you clothe them. If they need to be taken from one place to the other, you go with them, right? It's the full package. But when you care for God's people, not just about teaching them, but about their welfare, he says, that's when you begin to love me. And actually, more than a brother, but actually begin to love me closely. And in fact, the love you show to his children, you show to him. And he tells us that in Matthew as well, Matthew 16, I believe. And then the epitome of this great love is the feeding the lambs and taking care of the lambs. You feed a sheep by making sure he gets to the pasture. But how do you feed a lamb? How do you feed a lamb?
It takes a lot more work. You gotta milk the sheep and then put it in a bottle and catch the lamb and feed it to the lamb and make sure the lamb drinks it all and then do it all over again an hour later.
Yep. And the interesting thing is if the lamb is small enough, you probably have to hold the lamb. I love the picture of the shepherd with a lamb in his arms, right? Because if it's truly a lamb that needs to be fed, then we're not talking about a grazing sheep. We're talking about getting the milk, just exactly like you just said, getting the milk, but you have to get the lamb, you have to hold the lamb, you have to feed the lamb in your arms. I've actually done this before. And the poor little thing isn't that strong, and you have to care for it, you have to calm it down and help keep it gentled. And then the other thing that happens a lot of times is usually the reason you have to care for the lamb and that you have to feed the lamb is because something has happened to the mother, like the mother's died, right? And I think about true religion is this, that you help the widows and the orphans in their distress. And when you get the feeding the lamb conversation, that's a much more intensive conversation, but you're doing it to protect the lamb because it is without the natural protection of its mother. And Jesus is actually saying, when you're getting to that point, when you're looking for those that have no one to help them and protect them, and you're caring for them, and you're doing what it takes, catching them, holding them. You think about the hold and the embrace of the shepherd that's in that picture, and you can see what happens is you become connected to the lamb like you would to a little child. And that's what he's saying. When you get to that point, when that's where you are in your spiritual journey and you're helping those who cannot help themselves, and you may be doing it on my behalf, but you're becoming connected to them, that is when you'll learn to love me with an all-encompassing love, without consideration of how everyone else feels. And I think that's the ultimate ultimate place. But it's beautiful that he gives it to Peter, because Peter's frustration is that he's discovered that he doesn't love Jesus as much as he thinks he has, and it's shaken his confidence. And Jesus, of course, is not going to be with him personally for long, but he's saying, you've got the wrong end of the stick. Take care of those whom I love, and your love for me will be realized. It will be developed. It will grow. So quit worrying about how much love you have and go and serve, and it will take care of itself. And I love it because he's not holding anything over Peter's head. He's saying, this is how you're restored. And he doesn't just tell Peter, does he? Who else learns this lesson?
All the disciples surrounded.
And us. And I think that's the thing at the end of the day. We all fail in many ways, various ways, various times. But Jesus is telling us, quit fixating on where you fail. There's a path to love with me. There's a path to develop a relationship with me. There's a path to having brotherly love, and there's a path to having agape love. The way you get there is to focus on the family, to encourage each other, to strengthen each other, to build each other up. And in so doing, you're growing the family of God and developing your love for me. And that's Jesus' message, that we're developing our love for him as we do this, as we invest ourselves in those who are part of his flock. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And that's with a couple of corrections on the I'll make a couple of corrections and I'll send it to you. I don't know if you do I need to send it to a different email?
Send it to Ray.
Okay. I'll make a couple of corrections and I'll send it to Ray's email, and then y'all feel free to share it around. Let me go ahead and ask for a closing prayer, and then if there are any questions, I'll stay on the line. All right? So let's bow our heads. Father, we just praise your great and holy name. We thank you for the time we've had here this evening to consider your word. I personally thank you for the time that you've allowed me and privileged me to study in your word and to just continue to chew on these things, and that you keep showing us things as we go. And I pray that each and every person here will be benefited by their studies in the word, that you'll bless them and that you'll raise them up as your very children. We ask for your kingdom to come soon, and ask that every single one of us would have a place in it, and that we would get to revel in your glory for all time. We ask and we pray all of these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen. Okay. Now I'm available. You guys may be ready to go home, go to bed.
Have you ever done, did you know the